welcome to the Might Ramble podcast.
Ron, tell us about that.
Not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
From this distant vantage point, the Earth might not seem of any particular interest.
Hello, everyone. Before we begin, the views expressed in this podcast are our personal views and do not reflect those of any employer, university, research institution, funding body, or collaborator. Participation by guests does not imply endorsement of my views, nor does my hosting imply endorsement of theirs. Okay, that's all.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 20 of the Might Ramble podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Aislinn Williams, and she is an MD, PhD here at the University of Iowa. I have kind of been exploring this topic in neurobiology of mental health, and Aislinn came on my list. I actually have a personal story to this. So I have a loved one who has schizophrenia, and a couple years ago, probably like two and a half years ago, I was out in Rhode Island, and upon my loved one's diagnosis, I was trying to figure out, like, how can I help? I obviously can't cure my loved one, but I was like, I'm out in Rhode Island, I have a loved one back in Iowa, what is there, or what can I do to potentially help? And I had a nice brown.edu email at the time, and so I was like, can I find some people in the Iowa City area that might know more about schizophrenia and, you know, the local resources available and what you do with this type of thing? So I think I sent an email. I try to make each one personal per recollection. That might not be true. But I sent probably 5 to 10 emails to people that I thought would be knowledgeable about schizophrenia in the Iowa City area. And of those 5 to 10 emails, the only person that responded was Aislinn. Right? So I don't know if you remember that.
No, I don't.
I
have to go
this.
looking for it now.
Yes, and so as I was looking up, people to talk about schizophrenia with and kind of the neurobiology of mental health, I was like, there was that professor at the University of Iowa. I should reach back out. So that is my personal connection. Years prior to this interview, I was not expecting to ever be back with a podcast, so here I am. And I think there's a through line, though, between Aislinn being the only person who responded to that email and Aislinn also what she studies, this neurobiology of mental health, because also from personal experience, upon my loved one's diagnosis, I was also like, how can I potentially help, right, as a scientific researcher? And I had no neuroscience experience at the time, like my degrees are in chemistry, right? And I started pivoting kind of towards this space. And as I was pivoting towards this space, I found myself in an Alzheimer's lab that was essentially studying miniature brains outside of the human body, right? Stem cells that have been differentiated into different types of brain cells that have been genetically modified so that they exhibited certain characteristics of Alzheimer's, right? And this is a pretty common way to study Alzheimer's. I think, based on my research, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in 2024. Who knows about 2025, right? I don't know where it sits today, but I use 2024 as a general proxy. So this is a common way to study Alzheimer's, and I got to thinking, I was like, well, why don't we do this for like schizophrenia or like depression or like bipolar, right? And when we think of those types of disorders, we think of the external facing symptoms, right? Like people are down, people are hallucinating, et cetera, et cetera. So I started bringing this up to my advisor at the time, who was studying Alzheimer's in a dish. I was like, well, why don't we do this for schizophrenia? And I got a very quick dismissal of a sort of, essentially, it was like, hey, Mitchell, the thing is that we need to understand here is that schizophrenia, my cells, if I were to grow them up outside of the human body, they're not going to be hallucinating. They're not going to be having delusions, right? There's something uniquely human about schizophrenia, even if I were to do it in like a mouse, right? Mice don't think like people. And so it essentially was, dismissed with something along the lines of, this is not a problem we can solve, and it's probably not worth our effort to go to attempt to solve it, right? And I thought this was a one-off. This was not a satisfactory answer to me. So I went and talked to, another professor, and I ended up talking, I think, to like 3 to 5 professors maybe about this, and all of them gave me that, some version of that same response. And so I was like, okay, I'm running up here against something, right, that it's some type of inherited belief regarding what biology is worth studying in terms of like what's actually solvable, right? And so Aislinn is actually someone in this space, that does study the neurobiology of things like schizophrenia. And so I think this through line, though, between you being the only person who responded to my email when I, was asking for help years ago, and you also...
I hope I was helpful.
You were helpful, yeah. I forget I think it was like the AbbVie Center that you got to set up with? Yeah, so super helpful. But I think there's a through line between Aislinn being the only person who responded there and also going up against kind of this common notion, right, about what types of biology are worth studying and not. So what led, a couple years ago probably to you responding?
Sure. So I guess if I think about kind of where I got started thinking about being interested in mental health conditions, that largely came from my own experiences with my family. And I think if you had asked me about that when I was in medical school, I wouldn't say blocked it out, but I was really focused on other things. I was really focused on neurology. I was really focused on medical school. But when I go back and look at the things that I was interested in when I was finishing high school and getting into college, I was really interested in mental health at that time. My family, I've had several family members who had very severe depression, several family members who needed ECT, which is electroconvulsive therapy, which is something that is very heavily stigmatized culturally, but is still one of the most effective treatments we have for any condition, mental health or no. And so I saw those people with those disorders regularly when they were recovered from them, and I also saw them when they were ill. And I think it felt very important to me to say, well, we're starting to understand the brain. I was one of the first classes at my undergrad, Smith College, that had a neuroscience major that they could choose. So people had studied neuroscience before that, but I was in the first class where you could actually declare that as your major. And I thought, wow, if we are starting to decide that we could study the brain and have that be our main focus of study, why would we not be studying mental health conditions? They are manifestations of brain activity, are they not?
Yeah.
And I think the conversation that you had with multiple other people reflects how much we don't necessarily all think about it that way. And this is no slight against the people that you were working with before. People who work in Alzheimer's are very, very bright. And I think we tend to think of Alzheimer's as something that is happening within the brain that nobody could control. They didn't have any choice about having Alzheimer's. Somebody who has schizophrenia doesn't have a choice, but it doesn't feel quite the same as Alzheimer's. It feels like, oh, maybe there was something in their family that contributed to that. Or maybe these people who have schizophrenia, when they are really ill, they are fearful. They are scared of being around other people, and so they aren't as socially engaging in some way. So I think we have a tendency to think like, oh, these things are somehow fundamentally different.
Yeah.
But no brain organoid has Alzheimer's either. It doesn't have memories and engrams that are lost the way that a person who has Alzheimer's loses those memories and those engrams. So fundamentally, I don't see that they are, in a biologically meaningful way, fundamentally different. The manifestations are different, and how we historically have talked about the people who suffer from those conditions is wildly different.
Very different.
Wildly different. The other thing that's very funny to me about this conversation is that the old name for schizophrenia is dementia praecox, early dementia. So why would it somehow not make sense that you could think about all of those things? Maybe not in the same way, right? Because I don't think it's the same. I don't think they have the same underlying neurobiological mechanisms. But I still think it is worth saying, okay, if we have a new technology that we think is going to help us understand the brain better, and we think that it's going to help us understand these complex problems better, why would we not apply them to all of the complex problems that we currently don't understand? I think the other thing that sort of tends to make people feel like they're a little more, anxious maybe isn't the word anybody would like to use. I think anxious is a good word for describing why people might not want to step into that type of space with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, is that with Alzheimer's, the diagnosis feels more clear. Mm-hmm. It feels more like when you have a group of patients who has Alzheimer's disease, they all have a lot of similarities.
Yep, like amyloid amyloid plaques, right? Tau tangles, right? These are, I say, identifiable features for sure. Like quite visible, at least post-mortem, right?
Right. So you have very clear post-mortem brain changes, some of which you can now detect in vivo while the person is still alive, which is fantastic. That really helps with diagnostic clarity. And all of those people are going to have memory problems, and that unites them really strongly. So if you're going to then try to convert that into a more simplified model, like a brain organoid or using stem cells to model the brain, you can feel a little more confident that even though they come from lots of different people, you might ultimately be studying the same thing.
Yeah.
When you talk about depression, there are many, many different ways to experience depression. And when you talk to people, multiple different people, about their individual experiences of depression, some of them will have too much sleep. Some of them won't be able to sleep at all. Some of them will have anxiety. Some of them won't. Some of them will eat more food. Some of them will eat less food. And so it becomes much harder, I think, for people to feel confident that when they lump all of those individuals together into a single group and then try to move that into a simplified model, that they're really studying the same thing.
Yeah.
So I think, I don't want to suggest that there's no difference in complexity between these things, right? In psychiatry, our diagnoses are more complex, and we are, I think, relatively less refined in our diagnostic abilities than, for example, somebody who does cardiology, right? Sure. They can get really precise about exactly where the aberrant loop is that's causing this arrhythmia, right? We don't have that.
It's like if someone has a heart attack, we can get very, very precise in terms of this is where the blockage was. These are the cells that were damaged. This is exactly why this happened, right? Whereas if someone's depressed, it's
could have been any number of things. Yeah. It could be an infection. It could be that they were genetically predisposed. It could be they took a medication and that kind of tipped them in that direction.
Right. Going through a divorce. Right?
All of these things. Yeah. That is kind of how I think about the way that I got involved in doing this type of research. And the other thing that led me to doing this type of research was my interest in working with people who had mental health conditions as a clinician. So I'm a psychiatrist. I take care of people who have mental health conditions. And that was not something that I expected to enjoy when I was in medical school. When I was in medical school, I did my PhD in a neurology lab. I worked in movement disorders. I love my boss. I thought he was great. I still think he's great. He's still a fantastic person. I really enjoyed working with his patients. And then when I did neurology and psychiatry rotations back to back, I realized that I liked working with psychiatric patients more. I thought their life stories were interesting. I liked that the discipline asked me to learn about their life stories, asked me to learn about their social networks, asked me to learn about their coping strategies in ways that I felt like other disciplines didn't. So I just genuinely enjoyed working with psychiatric patients more. And so when I had done all of this training to work in neuroscience, it seemed to me to make perfect sense that I would translate that to mental health conditions.
I guess just like backing up a little bit. So you were at Smith College, which I think is a small school out on the East Coast.
That's correct.
And then you did your PhD here at the University of Iowa.
Yep.
And did you do that simultaneous with med school or separate things? Okay.
Yes.
So an MD PhD.
Yep.
And then after that, I think you went out to the University of Michigan.
Yep.
You did a postdoc.
Yeah. It's so I did my general adult psychiatry residency, and University of Michigan. Many schools have this, but University of Michigan had a program that had a research track within the residency, so that I would be able to do research while I was doing my residency program, and that really appealed to me because I knew that I wanted to try to build a career where both of those things meshed well together. I was a little less interested in doing just a residency and then trying to figure out a postdoc after that. I'd already done med school and grad school in a way where I was doing med school or grad school, but I wasn't doing research and clinical work at the same time. And I wanted a training opportunity that would teach me how I could try to integrate those things. And that was why I chose the Michigan program.
I gotcha. So like you knew long term that you wanted, both
program.
I gotcha. So like you knew long term that you wanted, both clinical and research, sides going on simultaneously.
Yeah.
And so you're like, this is something I'm going to need to learn how to do. So I'm going to find the right opportunity to do that, right, before I'm faculty. So you're at, out in Ann Arbor, and then you came back to the University of Iowa as faculty.
Yes.
And, so you have both a research lab, and do you still work in a clinic? I imagine so.
Yes, I work in the hospital, so I do not see patients who book individual appointments with me, but I see patients in the hospital.
And do you have a lot of carryover in terms of what you see in the hospital and then coming back to the research lab with ideas or this, made me think about this differently?
Yeah, historically I have. Right now I'm working in the eating disorder partial hospital program, so I don't do eating disorders research, so the ties are not quite so tight there. But anytime that I'm on call, I'm always rounding in the inpatient hospital units, and there are always going to be patients there who have mood disorders and thought disorders. So mood disorders would be depression, bipolar disorder. Thought disorders would be schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. So most of the patients who are on our inpatient units have one of those mental health conditions, along with some substance use disorder and some personality disorders. But you can imagine that a lot of the work that I do in the lab does relate to the patients that I see when I'm on call rounding in the hospital. And prior to working in the eating disorder program, I did work on the inpatient units, which are general psychiatry. And I think what the through line that tends to connect those things for me that I think is really important about the type of training that I have and the type of training that I hope people continue to be excited about getting is that in a clinical setting, people will tell you what they care about. From a research perspective, we often sort of pick symptoms and signs that we think are tractable, things that we could do something about. So a really good example would be, okay, if a person has schizophrenia and they have hallucinations, those are positive symptoms. It is a symptom, it is an experience that they have that is in addition to the typical experience. That is something that our medications are relatively good at managing. We have a lot of medications that target hallucinations. When you talk to people who take those medications, they will tell you that they still struggle socially, they still struggle with decision making, they still struggle with feeling like they are having a hard time being successful at jobs or being successful in relationships.
Feeling feelings, right?
Right. There's all these different things that the medications that we offer them don't address. And I think that if you don't interact with patients and you just read about schizophrenia in a textbook, you think, oh, schizophrenia is hallucinations and delusions. That's what it is.
Yep.
And our medications address those things. So we're kind of done here.
Yep.
And that's not accurate at all. There are a lot of things that patients want help with that our current medications are not targeting very well. And what that has, when you listen to what people say are their ongoing problems, that helps you think about, okay, what can I be doing in the lab that might actually address that?
Yep.
So it's it will feel like a long stretch from that to what I'm going to tell you we do, but as one example, we have mice that have manipulated versions of genes that we know are involved in schizophrenia.
And what are some of those genes?
So some of those genes are calcium channels, sodium channels, and then there are also these copy number variants, so parts of the chromosomes that are duplicated or deleted that tend to increase risk for schizophrenia. And so what we do with these mice is we don't ask the mice if they have hallucinations or delusions because they would have no way of communicating that to us. For all I know, they have them, but I don't have a way of understanding that experience of theirs. What I can probe is whether or not those mice can learn complex tasks the same way as their wild-type littermates. I can ask if there are things that they are actually better at than their wild-type littermates. And that might help us understand when we then go look at their brains, what is different in their neuronal circuitry, or their glial circuitry for that matter, that could have contributed to that behavioral difference that we saw. And then do we see that in schizophrenia postmortem brains, for example, or in the experiences that people with schizophrenia have? And can we try to build some translational relevance between those models and the things that patients are telling us they continue to suffer with. That's one of the ways that I think about how my clinical experience informs the lab. I don't run that sort of lab where I'm testing new therapies and then I can turn around and start a clinical trial for somebody. People do that, and I think that is wonderful work. I am more of I'm more like a little detective, right? Like I want to go in and pull apart the little tiny pieces, the synapses, the neurons, the developmental trajectories. That's kind of where my brain works best, I think. So my research work is not immediately translational, but it is done with a translational perspective.
Sure.
And when I say translational, I mean hoping that I can get from this very basic science, translating it toward human patients.
Yes, like actually making a difference in terms of the relevance to a human being someday down the line, right?
Yeah, with the hope of reducing suffering.
Yeah,
essentially.
For sure. I was hoping maybe we could just spend a little bit of time, I guess, kind of breaking down like what schizophrenia is, because I think when people hear that someone has schizophrenia, it sounds like this scary thing. There's kind of like some almost like mystery around it, but not in a good way.
Well, there's a lot of stigma.
It's like a lot of fear around the idea of someone having schizophrenia. So my understanding of schizophrenia is that there are positive symptoms, as you were saying, so things that go on for someone that has schizophrenia that are in addition to what would be otherwise probably a normal experience, right? So these are hallucinations and then delusions. And so what do I mean by delusions? Delusions are persistent, essentially odd or aberrant beliefs. Odd might not be the right term there, but so positive symptoms, hallucinations, and delusions, and these are kind of the canonical things that we associate with schizophrenia, right? And then what about negative symptoms? I was wondering if you could walk me through those.
Yeah, so negative symptoms they're called negative not because they are inherently bad, but because they are something that is decreased or dampened compared to what we would consider a typical human experience. So, for example, a lot of patients with schizophrenia and patients with depression as well experience something called anhedonia. They have difficulty enjoying things that they would have enjoyed prior to the disorder. So anhedonia is loss or lack of pleasure in things that would be classically considered pleasurable, like good food, anything that you might think is fun. They just sort of don't seem to find it as fun as they used to. Another one is alogia, which is talking less. That they just seem, many patients with schizophrenia, not all, this is not universal, but an example of a negative symptom would be that they just seem to have less to say. Another example would be something called paucity of thought. So the idea is not so much that they cannot think, but just that perhaps their brain is not generating as much spontaneous thought or spontaneous thought that they want to communicate compared to somebody who doesn't have schizophrenia. And there are some other examples as well of other negative symptoms, but that's essentially what is meant by negative symptoms is just a decrease or a dampening in what would be considered a typical human experience. And that's honestly often what patients with schizophrenia notice the most and feel is a loss the most. Many people with schizophrenia who have hallucinations, for example, even if the medication doesn't get rid of the hallucinations entirely, they can ignore them. They can say, I know that's just my mind doing a thing, it's just on its loop, and I'm just going to ignore that. It is not possible to ignore anhedonia. It's not possible to ignore apathy or lack of interest. That part is the part that I think tends to lead to the most suffering. But it's also the part that's invisible, right? If you look at a person, you can't tell that they're struggling with that necessarily.
Yeah, like how are they feeling? Do they have drive? Are they able to plan? Do they have the kind of a future in terms of what they or an idea in their head of what they want their future to be like, right?
And so that also gets to the third set of symptoms that sometimes are clustered in with negative symptoms, but I think of them separately, which are the cognitive symptoms. And these are the things that you were mentioning. Like, if I want to do something, like let's say I want to go visit my friend, that means I'm going to have to call my friend to make sure that they're around and they want to see me, and then I'm going to have to pack everything up that I need to go see them, and then I have to figure out how I'm going to get there, and that's, as we call executive function, the ability to make a plan and execute a plan to get the thing you want. And that's another thing that folks with schizophrenia often struggle with, that our medications and our treatments are not very good at helping with, is sort of helping them carry out the tasks of what humans consider to be important, right? And maybe this is part of why it's kind of hard to study this sort of thing in mice, is that different animals have different social structures, but humans think that it's important to get to your job on time.
Yeah.
Humans think that it's important to go to the birthday party you said you were going to go to. And that takes more planning than a lot of us think about. And when you have schizophrenia or another cognitive disorder, like Alzheimer's would be another example, those are the types of things that you really struggle with.
Yeah, so like, say you want to go to a birthday party, like what actually goes into that, it's like, well, I have to make sure that I get these other responsibilities taken care of so that I'm available to be able to go to this birthday party, right? So what you're saying is that people that have schizophrenia oftentimes, they would lack that ability to have like the foresight that they need to take care of, say, the other responsibilities in order to make it to the birthday party, or, you know, in addition to that, you know, do they even, by the time the birthday party comes, have a desire to go, right? Another thing I want to come back to here, as far as, I think you mentioned, you know, some people experience hallucinations, you know, they can learn to make a peace with them in some sense, as long as it's not to a degree where they're not able to, you know, perceive reality accurately enough to navigate, right? And yeah, that brings to mind, I have a friend, and she was diagnosed with schizophrenia probably, I don't know, in her early teens. Mm-hmm. And she had a pretty terrible time with it for a while. And as she's gotten into her adulthood, she's been quite high performing and has done quite well now for a long time. She's been pretty stable. I don't know if she's medicated or not, but, you know, when I've talked to her about her experience with hallucination, she was like, yeah, it was really terrible until I made a peace with it and just said, this is me, right? And I quit fighting it so much. And ever since then, like, you know, I still experience hallucinations, but they're not necessarily like of a negative nature all the time, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, and I think that is very much at odds with the stories that we tend to tell about mental illness in general. We sort of tend to tell the story that disorders like schizophrenia are persistent, severe, unchanging, and that they are going to destroy this person's life. And while that has certainly happened to people, and I don't want to minimize the suffering that these disorders can cause, we do also have really good strategies from a psychological perspective that can really help people. So there's a type of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis that helps people with executive function, helps them with reality testing, helps them with social anxiety. And there are many people who've benefited a lot from that. I think people who experience those symptoms and get help quickly, so the duration of untreated psychosis, the shortest that we can keep that is the best predictor we have for positive long-term outcomes. Yeah. And there are definitely people walking around that you would never know that they had schizophrenia. They have families, they have jobs, they have satisfying relationships and strong sense of self, because they got good help at the time that they needed it, and they were able to maintain that help, you know, during the time that they have needed to manage their illness.
Yeah. There's kind of this, oftentimes prior to someone being diagnosed with schizophrenia, I think it's called the prodromal phase, where things are kind of ramping up, right? And it takes a while, you know, for, I guess, society to catch on to a degree where it's like, okay, something's up with you, right? But keeping, you know, the window where real active psychosis is going on, keeping that window as short as possible, what you're saying, is the best long-term predictor in terms of making it back to reality, so to speak.
Well, and to be able to have a good quality of life, right? I think that there are many ways in which mental illness, what we classify as mental illness, has actually enriched human experience. There is a lot of overlap between the genetics of creativity and the genetics of mental illness.
It's interesting,
right?
Yeah.
And if you look at our global history of musicians, artists, writers, the incidence of mental illness in people who excel at those things is higher than that of the general population. So I don't approach these disorders as like enemies that we have to eliminate or vanquish. I do think that I want to help reduce people's suffering, and I want to hear from them what is causing them to suffer and try to help with that. And if there's something that isn't necessarily contributing to their suffering, it doesn't matter if it's something that would bother me. If it doesn't bother them, then it doesn't bother them.
Yeah.
And I should be working on the thing that bothers them.
Yeah. Have you ever heard the perspective that schizophrenia, so essentially, as we operate in the world and go and do our things, we have an internal life that's going on, right? And then we obviously have an external, reality that we're perceiving, and schizophrenia being essentially that filter in terms of like inner life and outer life getting broken in some sense where things are seeping through. I guess, are you familiar with that perspective, and do you have thoughts on that?
Sure. So I have definitely heard this conceptualization of schizophrenia as an impaired filtration system, basically, right? So as humans, we don't think a lot about our interoception or our internal sense of what's going on, but our brain is actively ignoring information all the time.
A lot of information.
A lot of information. And it has been proposed that what's happening in schizophrenia, and that might also be happening in some forms of autism, and in some forms of intellectual disability, is that basically that ability to suppress response to stimuli is impaired in some way. In mice, for example, we test that with something called pre-pulse inhibition.
What's that?
And so pre-pulse inhibition is an assay where we basically have an animal in a soundproof chamber, and there is an accelerometer underneath that chamber, so we can tell when they move. And what we'll do is we'll play a tone, and usually because it's a soundproof chamber, when they hear the tone, they kind of jump a little.
Jump, yeah.
And so we can measure how much they're jumping. Well, with humans and mice, if you play a quieter tone before the louder tone, the jump that happens to that louder tone is not so big. And it's called pre-pulse inhibition. So there was a pre-pulse before the pulse. So the pre-pulse is the quieter sound. The pulse is the louder sound. Pre-pulse inhibition describes the phenomenon that hearing that warning, basically, helps you suppress your response to the bigger thing that comes later.
Yep.
And for folks with schizophrenia, on average, that is impaired. So they don't have as much pre-pulse inhibition. So they're paying just as much attention and they're responding just as strongly regardless of the input that happened. And there are a lot of other types of assays that are similar to that sort of say, if we provide you with this sort of information, how does your brain respond to a variation in that information? And those filtration systems do seem to be altered in schizophrenia. They are also altered in, like I said, some forms of autism and intellectual disability. And what my lab studies is whether or not there are certain genes that are important for the way that the brain wires that makes it more or less likely that that filtration system or that buffer system will be more or less functional than it would be on average.
Interesting. And I think specifically, I know that you've done some work like with voltage-gated calcium channels.
Yep.
So I was wondering if you could walk us through kind of the basics of voltage-gated calcium channels. My understanding is that they are molecular complexes, primarily proteins, right? So there's like different, units within this molecular complex, like an alpha, I don't know what it's called, like an alpha unit and a beta subunit, but essentially, if you were to just take a snapshot of some brain cells, if you were to look outside the cells, there would be a lot of calcium, right? Let's say that there's 1 million calcium outside of the brain cells. Then if you were to look inside the cells, in general, there might be 1/1,000,000th of the amount of calcium within the cells compared to, outside the cells. And so that there are these channels, right? Because the concentrations outside the cell wants to equal the concentration in the cell. Channels that keep that gradient at certain levels and then selectively, decide when to let in more calcium.
Yep.
Yeah.
That is a really good explanation. So I'll just add like a little extra flavor on top of that. So that's exactly what voltage-gated calcium channels are. So any channel in a membrane can be open or closed, and it can open or close depending on the signals that particular channel has evolved to respond to. So a voltage-gated channel is a channel that opens when the voltage across the membrane that it sits in has achieved a certain level.
Yeah.
And so different channels will open or close at different voltages based on how they've evolved. And then they will also close by different mechanisms. So voltage-gated calcium channels are channels that, for, very complex molecular reasons, when they open, the only thing that goes through is calcium. Sodium doesn't go through, potassium doesn't go through, only calcium.
Like very selective filters.
Very selective filters. And they open at the voltage that they open at, which is based on the electrical charge within that channel itself. And then they close partially due to that voltage being dropping below or above whatever their gating characteristics were. And then some of them also have fast inactivation systems where they basically have like a part of the protein that swings shut and that blocks the channel from letting more in. And you evolutionarily would want that because you don't want calcium to constantly be flowing in,
right.
Because that can trigger other intracellular cascades that can cause problems, including cell death. So these voltage-gated calcium channels, the reason my lab studies them is that when we look across the entire population, and we're asking what are the genes that have variation in them that seems to increase risk for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, these voltage-gated calcium channel genes pop out. So not every gene is a risk factor for a disorder.
And did these pop out prior to, our understanding of why this may be the case, if that makes sense? Like, what, did we just find this signal and we better look into that more?
Well, so we've known about voltage-gated calcium channels for decades, but they were studied because they were a really interesting mechanism by which calcium, like you said, goes from a place where it is at a high concentration to a lower concentration, and it causes changes inside the cell. One of the things that calcium does in the cell is that it actually modifies gene expression. So there is excitation, transcription, coupling that occurs in neurons. So the neurons get excited, and we often think of neurons as having action potentials. When that happens, when neurons have action potentials, the voltage of that cell is changing. And that is what's letting calcium in. And that calcium then binds to intracellular factors that then go to the nucleus and increase gene expression. So there's a very direct relationship between this cell is active and it changes its gene expression.
So it's like there's a medium of sorts in terms of calcium being just an ion getting coupled with something else, and then that actually being, electrical signal ending up getting transmitted as a biological difference, I guess, so to speak. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So we knew about that before we ever knew it was related to schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Now, over time, people had hypothesized that those genes might be relevant because we knew that these ion channels were important for gene expression. And we thought that gene expression was probably different between people who had mental illnesses and not.
Seems likely, yeah.
Right? And so what people initially did actually was they did what were called candidate gene approaches. So they would start screening for mutations in genes that they thought were important in populations of people who have the disorder and don't. And so in that way, we identified that there are some mutations in these genes that are associated with the disorder. But that doesn't actually explain most of the disorder. So most people who have schizophrenia don't have a frank mutation, meaning that they don't have a genetic change that changes the protein itself.
Because most mutations don't actually, end up resulting in, say, an amino acid shift, or even if there is an amino acid shift, it
may not be relevant.
Yeah.
It might not be that important. So when these candidate gene studies suggested that these genes were relevant, but it was also, like I said, clear that that didn't actually explain most of the disorder. And I will just say that I trained not too long after we discovered the gene that causes the vast majority of Huntington's disease and the mutation in that gene that causes the vast majority of Huntington's disease. And people thought, amazing. Now we just have to do that for every other disorder, right? And for more complex disorders, maybe there will be a handful of genes, not just the one. Well, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression have defied all of that. There is not a single gene. There's not a handful of genes. There's probably hundreds of genes that alter the risk for these disorders. And what we learned from these genome-wide association studies where we were looking across the entire genome and saying in an unbiased way, I don't care what the outcome is. If I'm looking across the whole genome, minus the sex chromosomes. We always leave those out. We look across the whole genome. Where is the variation in the genome associated with the disorder? And that's where these voltage-gated calcium channel genes popped out. But the variation in those genes that's associated with disorders are in the non-coding regions. So they are in the parts of the gene that don't get turned into a protein. But those parts of those genes are important for regulating that gene. And they could be important for regulating other genes quite far away. So it's a much more complicated story than we had ever hoped that it would be. And it really, I think, highlights how very complicated this problem can be, that there are going to be some people who have what looks like a quote-unquote very simple explanation for their disorder. They have a mutation. We can find it. We can point to it and say, other people who've had that mutation have that disorder. So we have a strong sense that that's causative. The vast majority of people are not going to have such a satisfactory explanation in their genetics yet. I emphasize yet. Because we have not done all the genetics that could be done. We have not analyzed it in every way that it could be analyzed. But for the majority of people who have bipolar disorder, for example, they do not have a single gene with a single point mutation and an amino acid that's going to explain why they have that disorder.
Probably some collection of risk factors, and for whatever reason, under the right circumstances, it came to fruition. But I guess zooming out a bit on schizophrenia, so what is the typical age of onset? I know a little bit about this in men, but I also know that sex is an important variable as far as when it comes to the brain, for sure, and onset. So, yeah, what really is kind of the age range there, I guess, for both men and women when schizophrenia typically comes to fruition?
Yeah, so for men it is typically a bit younger, and so we usually say that the late teens, early 20s range is the most likely age of onset for men. It doesn't mean that you can't have it later in life, but generally speaking, men are going to have an age of onset that's in late teens, early 20s. For women, that tends to be a bit broader, a little bit later, and there is a second peak for women that's around menopause. There are some people who feel that those disorders are different, right? That if you have postmenopausal or menopausal onset of your schizophrenia, that is probably a different mechanism than somebody who had their onset at age 20 or age 25. But those are the demographics of it. Yeah. And the reason for it, we don't know. We've always, the idea gets thrown around that estrogen is a protective factor. And so that would explain why going through menopause increases the risk of the disorder starting up, because you're losing that protective estrogen effect. And it also is mentioned as a hypothesis for why the age of onset for women at that younger age tends to be a little bit later than it is for men. But we also can't just give people more estrogen and their schizophrenia goes away. So I don't know that we understand that particularly well.
Does it correlate at all, like, say, men, at least relatively speaking, I think absolutely speaking, right, have lower estrogen levels, and estrogen is a protective factor. Would that correlate at all with, men's onset tending to be concentrated in more of a younger range?
It's possible. We also know that in general, and this is going to be a very hand-wavy statement, but in general, neurodevelopmental conditions in men tend to occur at younger ages and tend to be more severe. So if you think about severe forms of autism, for example, there is a predisposition that boys are going to be diagnosed with that more than girls. And that happens partially, I think, due to some social constructs for how we expect boys to behave and how we expect girls to behave. But even if you take that into account, neurodevelopmental diagnoses tend to be more common in males than females. And schizophrenia, I think, my hypothesis is that schizophrenia is a neurodevelopmental condition. It just does not manifest until around the time of puberty. And so it wouldn't surprise me if the pubertal period for men is shorter than the pubertal period for women, right? Because we know it just tends to be a bit longer in women.
Different curve, for sure.
It's a different curve. Yeah. Exactly.
What at those typical ages of onset, let's say we're looking at the younger onset, for men and women, does that track at all with like a normal developmental trajectory in terms of like a specific set of brain happenings that typically occur in that age?
So I would say that the answer is we don't really know, because we don't actually know very much about the development of the brain at that time. actually right now there is a study going on that I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's the ABCD study. And it's a multi-site study that's actually examining neurodevelopment using neuroimaging in people that age longitudinally, because we simply don't even know what that looks like in people of that age. So it's hard to know if something different is happening in schizophrenia if we don't know what's happening in typically developing children.
Don't we have, though, I forget what it's called, it's essentially like on a normal developmental trajectory, for example, when people are teenagers, a common experience is like you start to kind of consolidate an identity of sorts.
Yeah.
You get more firm in it, right? And so that we know psychologically what's going on, but then it's the time when many connections in the head essentially get snipped, right? Like synaptic pruning is something that, typically occurs during adolescence, right? And we get more firm in who we are. So,
and we also know that myelination is sort of a later stage of development. And I have not followed the literature really closely on this, but it's my understanding that myelination processes continue until like mid-20s. So we do know of some we definitely do know of some things that occur developmentally during that window of time. I didn't mean to imply that we literally don't know anything about it. We don't know the temporal gradient across which those happen, certainly for individuals, and how that differs between people who are going to go on to have schizophrenia and people who are going to go on not to have schizophrenia. And that's something that's been of great interest for a long time. There's also research. So the way that that's been researched historically is to recruit people who have family members, close family members with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, whichever disorder it is you want to study. So recruiting people who whose parents have those disorders or have a sibling with that disorder, and try to compare them prospectively and then follow and say which of them go on to have schizophrenia, which ones don't, and then retrospectively go back to the neuroimaging that you took earlier and see, could you see differences? And I am not an expert in neuroimaging, but there are definitely quite a lot of studies that have identified differences in the brain development and the connectivity of people who ultimately do go on to have a schizophrenia diagnosis or a bipolar disorder diagnosis and people who don't. Interestingly, there's also some interesting findings in people who are clinical high risk and don't go on to have the disorder, and people who are not at clinical high risk.
What do we mean by, I guess, like clinical risk here?
Risk, as a family member, first degree family member with a disorder, or in some instances, they have started to have some experiences themselves that could be like part of that under that umbrella. So we talked before about the schizophrenia prodrome, and the prodromal period is itself non-specific. It doesn't include hallucinations and it doesn't include delusions, but it often includes social withdrawal, increase in social anxiety. That's also something that just happens for some teenagers, full stop. And so it can be really hard to distinguish the prodrome from this is a teenage kid having a teenage time.
Like something's off,
it's
right?
It's really hard to tell the difference. And so what we know is that if we're talking about schizophrenia, for example, studies that take kids who they're not considered to be at elevated risk compared to the general population, kids who are at clinical high risk but don't go on to have the disorder, and kids who are at clinical high risk and go on to have the disorder, those three groups have distinct brain developmental differences. So one hypothesis would be that the people who are at clinical high risk but don't go on to develop the disorder have some resilience mechanisms that we don't understand yet. Either genetically they have some resilience, or behaviorally they have some resilience. They have something going on in their lives or in their brains that reduces that likelihood or that prevents that manifestation of that disorder. And I think it's easier to conceptualize that for something like PTSD, because people who have PTSD, in order to have a diagnosis of PTSD, something traumatic must have happened to you. You don't know that you will not develop PTSD until you die, right? Because at any point, something might happen, and then you find out, oh, I am a person who could manifest PTSD. So PTSD, I think, is a really good example of something where you could be a person who has elevated risk, never have the disorder, because nothing happens to you in your life that triggers the onset of that disorder.
There was no specific circumstance or set of
Right.
circumstances that tipped you over the edge, so
Exactly.
to speak. Yeah.
And with schizophrenia, we do know that there are certain things that can tip people over. So cannabis use can tip people over. And I know that's a really unpopular thing to say, and people really, I'm not trying to say that I think cannabis is dangerous for everybody. I don't like to make blanket statements like that, but we do know that for clinical high-risk populations, cannabis use lowers the age of onset and can sometimes cause manifestation that might not have happened in that person. Right?
Cannabis may be a gateway of sorts, right, into a disorder like schizophrenia. Not for everyone, but
Exactly.
it's going to increase the risk for some people. For sure.
Exactly. And similarly, alcohol use or other exogenous substance use can, in a brain that is more likely to develop those symptoms, can, unveil that predisposition. And we don't really have a way of knowing who that's going to apply to and who it doesn't apply to, but I think that is one way of considering this concept of risk, because people are not born with schizophrenia. People are not born with bipolar disorder. They're born with some level of risk, and then life happens. And we can do things that bolster resilience, and we can do things that reduce resilience. And that's something that in our culture we are not great at. We tend to sort of, if a person has a sickness, we're like, where's the pill? Where's the pill that we can give them that's going to fix this? And for a lot of these conditions, not only is there not a pill, but there are other strategies that we could use that would improve quality of life without some of the side effects that medications. We don't tend to use those very much.
Yeah, for sure. One thing, are there any hypotheses that you know of as far as this idea that, say, some form of exogenous substance use, right, leading to the onset of a psychotic disorder, correct my terminology if I use anything wrong, but a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia, in the sense that, like, imagine a person as a record that plays, right? It's like normal, you're hearing the music, insert exogenous substance, right? It's kind of like a scratch in the record, so to speak. But then, once the substance is out of the body, right, you would think the record just goes back to spinning how it was, but it's undeniably true, right, that certain forms of exogenous substance use for certain people, right, but for particular individuals may, lead to the onset of a psychotic disorder like that. And so there must be some molecular underpinnings there in terms of, the record getting scratched and staying scratched, so to speak. I was just curious if you knew of any, ideas in that realm of things.
I don't know of anything that's been formally presented as such. I'm sure there are people who are working on it and have really creative ideas about how that might happen. What comes to mind for me is a little bit what we were talking about before, this concept of development. So in order for your brain to develop, quote unquote, correctly, certain things have to happen in the right amount, at the right time, in the right context. And that developmental window isn't forever. And it isn't necessarily something we can then go back and change. So what I wonder about, as an example, is that, so there's been a lot of really interesting work done on how microglia, so those are...
Microglia are awesome.
They're very cool. Finally getting the attention that I think they have always deserved. But microglia are a form of cell that functions kind of like an immune cell in your brain. And they do a lot of different things, but specifically what I'm thinking of in this context is that they eliminate synapses that have been tagged for elimination by proteins that say to the microglia, it is time to eat this synapse and get rid of it, right? And so one hypothesis could be that if you have an exogenous substance that makes those microglia too active at the time that they're supposed to be doing that, they start eating synapses that they shouldn't eat. Or perhaps the protein that gets deposited, that's the eat me signal, that gets deposited more randomly. And then once those synapses are gone, if there isn't a signal in the brain's genetic code or neuronal function that says make more synapses, you now have fewer than you should. And we do see that in schizophrenia with and without substance use disorder, right? If we look at postmortem samples of brain from people who have schizophrenia, we do see that certain neuronal types seem to have fewer synapses than they should. They seem to have a less elaborate arbor. So when you look at neurons, they are described as having arbors because it kind of looks like a tree. That those arbors are less elaborate than they should be. And so you could imagine that for this situation of an exogenous is applied at a time that is particularly vulnerable, it might push that system in a way that that system does not then have any instructions to recover from. Similarly, if a person doesn't have any substance exposure, right, but you're just talking about their endogenous genes, there's this really interesting study that came out, I want to say about a decade ago, looking exactly at this concept of what tells the microglia to eat a particular synapse. And what this group discovered, so this was Steve McCarroll and Beth Stevens out of Harvard, what they discovered was that we all have different versions of this complement gene that is like the eat me signal. And that there are certain versions that are super common and certain versions that are more rare. Of the top 4 most common, there is a range of schizophrenia risk depending on which combo of those eat me genes you have.
I'm thinking of this essentially like, imagine you have a book, right? And imagine you're putting in like sticky notes in the book. So essentially that there are different colored sticky notes that catch your attention to varying degrees depending, say like the bright green sticky note is probably going to get my attention over like the beige sticky note that looks like, another textbook page, right? And so depending on what sticky notes I tend to use in my book, I'm going to land on certain pages, right, and do different things with them. Would that be a fair analogy?
I think that's a really good analogy because the idea isn't that you don't have sticky notes or that the brain doesn't know how to respond to the sticky note, but that the proportion of them or the intensity of them differs between different people. And so it was a really fascinating study of something that is important for normal brain function. So normally, your microglia should be eating some synapses. You don't want to leave them all there. They're not all ones you want to keep. But if the wrong ones get removed or the wrong proportion get removed, basically what you've done is you've changed the overall functional circuit. And that may or may not be something that we can address later on, either with a medication or with transcranial magnetic stimulation, for example, things like that. And people are working on trying to understand how to modify circuits that have been quote unquote set. And there's a lot of fascinating work being done there. But I think that's one way of conceptualizing what might be happening when somebody has an experience, whether it is a substance or a stressor, because of course there are a lot of stressors that happen in teenage, early adulthood, that could be pushing people toward a final brain connectivity state that is more or less prone to whatever illness. That
went a change in network connectivity, some type of delta because of some exogenous substance altered the behavior of like this probably should have been cut at this time or like this shouldn't have been cut at this time essentially.
Yeah, and that's just one idea, right? There are lots of other theories about the etiology of schizophrenia, and we certainly don't have time to talk about all of them. I do think that is one particularly interesting one for thinking about developmental timing, which is something that I think the field is thinking a lot more about lately.
What is the relationship between schizophrenia and vision? Because I've seen this over and over that there's not one blind person, right, or someone that was born blind that ends up with schizophrenia. And I'm very curious, like, what is, one, is this, do you believe this to be true? Because I'm always like, really? And two, like, what are any hypotheses there as to, like, if that is true, why would that be the case?
Right, so, I do not know that I can say one way or the other epidemiologically has such a thing happened. I think that sort of like my example about the 16p duplications versus deletions, there's always going to be an exception to the overall rule. What I wonder about is if part of what happens during a change in vision is that there is some other compensatory mechanism that increases the accuracy, fidelity, or filtering mechanisms for other senses, right? So we think of ourselves having 5 or 6 senses, depending on if you count interoception as a sense. And so if you have one that is not functioning so well, or that you simply never had, it stands to reason that there's going to be more attention paid to how those other systems function. And it could be that alone sort of reduces the risk that you're going to have, the quote unquote filtration problem that we discussed as a hypothesis for schizophrenia. The other thing that's very interesting, there's a syndrome that I think is called Charles Bonnet syndrome. It's been a long time since I was in medical school, so forgive me if I am saying the wrong thing. But there is a syndrome in which people who are blind and fully blind, like no light perception, not low vision, but fully blind, experience visual hallucinations. And they don't develop schizophrenia. They don't think that the thing that they are seeing is actually there. But they will tell you, and I met a person who had this syndrome where, we asked about their experience, and he's like, yeah, this is what I see, and what he saw were relatively complex visual hallucinations. And he knew they weren't there.
He was aware that wasn't reality.
Yep. And that was not a problem for him whatsoever. Didn't bother him that he had it. He's like, yeah, I know what's happening.
Yeah.
And it never changed into something different from that. But yeah, in terms of like the statistics, like is there anybody who's ever developed that? Of course there's somebody who has,
Probably,
but
yeah.
But are there lots? I don't know. Whereas being low vision or being blind is a relatively common phenomenon, globally. So I am sure that if that is what the statistics say, then that is accurate. Why that would be, I don't know.
Whenever I've done research on schizophrenia, just like broadly speaking, that's always one of like the first things that pops up, or it's like within the first list of facts about schizophrenia. What is the prevalence of schizophrenia in just the population writ large?
In general, we say that about 1% of the population has schizophrenia, so 1 in 100 people. So if you know 100 people, the odds are good that at least one person who has schizophrenia. Now, it's not uniform across the entire globe, but it's fairly uniform, and it doesn't seem a sex predisposition. So we talked about the age of onset can differ for people of different sexes, but it's not more prevalent in one sex over another. And there are some places where the incidence is a little bit higher and some places where the incidence is a little bit lower. The other thing that seems to vary globally is the social experience of people who have schizophrenia. So there are communities in which the community is tight-knit, people are very supportive, and there's a lot of social support for the person who has the illness, and in general, those people do better, right? They live longer lives, healthier lives, they have better access to the sorts of social supports that make life livable during stressful situations. And if you have communities in which that is less likely, then those people tend to do more poorly, right? You can, this is kind of where we get the stereotype of people with schizophrenia being homeless, unhoused,
violent,
aggressive, these sorts of things. Statistically, people with schizophrenia are far more likely to be the victims of violence than aggressors. But of course, that's not the story that's most commonly told. And in those situations, oftentimes it is very difficult to help somebody who is really suffering with their reality testing or suffering from fear, right? Because their symptoms can cause a lot of fear, to help get them into socially supportive situations that might actually help them live better lives.
Bring them back into the fray, right?
Yeah.
I think you mentioned something about schizophrenia, being deficits in connectivity. Is that a global phenomenon in the brain, or is that within like a localized region? Like, for example, off the top of my head, I would imagine that when it comes to the areas of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, specific areas within there as far as executive functioning, I would imagine there probably are, connective deficits there in schizophrenia, but does that extend just within particular regions or like throughout the brain, I guess?
Yeah, it is quote unquote relatively global in the sense that I am not aware of any brain region that has been studied closely in which there is literally no difference whatsoever. But it does seem like the frontal cortices, the temporal cortices, the cerebellum, those are impacted. I think the visual cortex is maybe a little less impacted, parietal cortex maybe a little bit less impacted, but it is global in that sense that it does not appear that there is a brain region. There's not one specific brain region. It's like, yes, if we could just fix whatever's happening in the frontal cortex, everything else is generally fine. For the longest time, we talked about Alzheimer's disease as being like, really it's a disorder that's like mostly in the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex. Well, when we look more globally, the problems are everywhere. Yeah.
Parkinson's, though, would be maybe an exception to that.
I would
as far
agree,
as like it's a very concentrated region of, I think, where dopamine producing cells go wrong.
Exactly. So there are definitely disorders in which the primary neurobiological problem is more narrow. But the reason in Parkinson's, for example, that loss of dopaminergic cells is super important is that that's the main source of dopamine for the entire brain. So the projections from those neurons go everywhere.
Yeah.
So is the frontal cortex impacted? Yes. Is the parietal cortex impacted? Yes. All of that is impacted, but all because largely in most cases of idiopathic Parkinson's because of that very focal loss that has broad impacts. In schizophrenia, there's not a brain region like that where it's like, if we could just do this one thing, then that would correct the deficits that occur.
So when it comes to schizophrenia, there's this prodromal stage. Well, I guess we'll start there. How long can that stage last, or how long does it typically last?
If I remember correctly, the average is about 6 months.
Okay.
And usually what people describe is social withdrawal, that the person who is having this prodromal state is not doing some of the things they typically used to do. If they were playing sports, they maybe don't really want to do that anymore. They stop going to the practices, they stop calling their friends, they sort of appear to socially withdraw. And that happens before onset of the sorts of symptoms that people would say constitute schizophrenia. So they aren't necessarily having frank hallucinations or delusions, but social anxiety is increasing and that social withdrawal is increasing. Sometimes you can see some paranoia in that, but even that usually is not very profound. Like if you ask somebody who is in a prodromal state, like, are you afraid that somebody's trying to hurt you or that somebody's out to get you? That's generally not the reason that they would give for why they're socially withdrawing. It's just they just don't want to do those things anymore. So the period of time can be longer than that, but when it extends longer than that, it can be hard to know that it's even happening, right? Like if it's happening in a 6 month window, if it's happening in a 6 month window, you can say like, this person is a junior in high school, and when I knew them as a sophomore, they were outgoing, had all these friends, did all these activities, their grades were a certain way, and here they are at the beginning of their junior year, and this is not the same person. This person is not doing well in their classes. This person is not. Their personality seems to be changing. They're sort of losing interest. Now, of course, that could also be depression, right? So you have to do a lot of screening to figure out. There's a lot of overlap
in psychiatry. The symptom overlap between things, they bleed, right? Hence, why this type of work, actually unpacking what constitutes a disorder in terms of like the biological components, right, and where those boundaries actually lay. It's super important.
Yeah, and oftentimes people who are in that prodromal state, they'll be noticed by their teachers and their parents, right? That their teachers will say like, oh man, I knew this kid, and this kid just seems like something is changing.
Yeah.
The parents will notice it too. And when you talk to the person who's going through it, they don't always seem to have that same experience of it. Like they might factually understand that like their grades are not so good anymore. But one of the distinguishing factors that I've noticed is that when a person is depressed, they will often say like, I feel sad, or I feel just so flat. Like I just don't, and I feel bad. Like I do not enjoy this. This feels bad to me. And a person in the prodrome doesn't necessarily feel like it is bad. It doesn't necessarily feel as unpleasant as depression feels. Depression feels unpleasant generally. So that's one thing that can help distinguish. And the other things that 6 month window sort of helps because it's a relatively compact time window for seeing a difference. when you have a long prodrome, it's harder to tell, like you were saying. It's sort of like, well, maybe that person is just, their personality is changing, right? They're just becoming a teenager, and they'd always been outgoing before, but now they're a little bit quieter, but not a lot quieter, and they just kind of like don't feel like playing in the band anymore. That's okay. You're allowed to not like the same things as you used to when you were, when you were 15. You don't have to like what you liked when you were 13. So those longer prodromal periods, I'm sure, occur, but we aren't so good at detecting them. And in those cases, it can be much harder to tell when a person, usually people come to clinical attention when they start to say that they're having these symptoms that are scaring them. Sometimes they come to clinical attention because they have attempted to hurt themselves in some way because those symptoms are so distressing and they feel so uncomfortable. And sometimes they come to clinical attention because they behave in a way that seems bizarre. So they may be found wandering out around at night, not wearing the correct clothing for the weather that they're in, or something like that.
Like they're, when I say brought to attention.
They are brought to clinical attention without necessarily having volunteered themselves for clinical attention. Yeah, for
sure. Yeah. I've read that in like young children, right, not the typical age of onset for schizophrenia, that I think it was put that schizophrenia and autism spectrum disorder present almost identically. And so I don't know if you know anything about that, or like where that perspective may be coming from.
Sure. So I'll just say outright, I've never seen a case of childhood onset schizophrenia. It does occur. It is very rare. I have not seen it, but I'm also not a child psychiatrist, so I see very few children in general clinically. So, but you could imagine that if a child is having differences compared to their siblings in terms of the types of interests that they have, how socially engaged they seem to be, what they seem to be paying attention to, if the kid is really young, they can't necessarily tell you, oh, it's not a hallucination, and imaginary friends and imaginary play are normal up until age 10, right? So I did, when I was in residency, work in a psychiatric emergency room, and we did have some parents bring kids in that they were like, oh my gosh, my kid is experiencing these hallucinations that are really distressing. And like one example that is funny in retrospect, it was not funny at the time, it was not, these parents were legitimately distressed. As the kid was talking to me about what was happening and what they were thinking about, I was like, that's a Batman movie. That is a Batman movie. And I was like, did you see this Batman movie? And they're like, yeah. And I was like, where did you see that? And it was like at a friend's house. And these poor parents had never seen this movie. And so they're like, this kid is talking about killing this person and killing that person, and da-da-da. And I was like, so this kid saw a movie that developmentally they were not ready for. And now they're play acting it out. Yeah. But you could see how it's really tough in early childhood, in some instances, to know whether is typical. Are they struggling to adjust to an experience that maybe they weren't developmentally ready for? And in the case of autism versus a childhood onset schizophrenia, if that child is not old enough to explain using words we would understand what their experiences are, it could look like they are quote unquote responding to internal stimuli when they're engaging in imaginary play, but they can't explain that to you because they don't have those words just yet. Yeah. So, and autism, of course, is going to be far more common than childhood onset schizophrenia. The other thing that I'll say is unrelated to your specific question, but related to sort of how I think about disorders of cognition in general, is that one of the groups that I work with is called Families SCN2A Foundation. And this is a family-based foundation that was started by families whose children have mutations in the SCN2A gene. It's a voltage-gated sodium channel gene. Okay. And it's best known as a risk factor for epilepsy and really severe epilepsy. And children who have mutations that cause that tend not to live until adulthood. It's a really severe neurodevelopmental condition. For the kids who have loss of function mutations, not all of them do develop epilepsy, but many of them do have significant communication limitations. So they are capable of communicating, but they wouldn't necessarily communicate primarily verbally. Like perhaps they might use iPads to communicate or other forms of communication. And when somebody has always lived with a different set of communication skills it can be hard to know what they're experiencing because they may not have a way of communicating that to you. And I've talked to the families about this because we know that SCN2A is a risk factor for bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. How would I know if a person who is 13, who has never spoken a word in their life and doesn't necessarily use their communication tools in the way that their parents use their communication tools, how do I know if they are experiencing grandiosity? How do I know if they have a delusion of grandeur? I have no way of knowing that. So we tend not to we don't diagnose those kids with those disorders because we can't identify what they are. It doesn't mean that they don't have them. It just means that we are bad at figuring out what their experience is. So that's one of the things I've been thinking about a lot with those families, because their children have distressing experiences that they feel like they can't help with and that they don't understand. And of course they want their kids not to feel distress. And so it's just sort of like this hunting game of like, okay, are they in pain? Are they constipated? Are they hungry? Like
what's wrong?
What's going on? And when you go through your full litany of things and none of it seems to have helped, there is the possibility that your child is experiencing something that you have not tried to sort out with them before because it didn't occur to you that it could be happening to them. And again, that's a gap in the medical field where we sort of think like, oh, if a person doesn't tell us that they're having this problem, they are not having this problem. Yeah. And that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, people's ability to interrogate their own, internal experience, it varies so widely.
Oh, absolutely, right. So one of my other jobs that I do is that I supervise residents in psychotherapy, which is very different from all of the things that we've discussed so far. And it is really fascinating to sit and talk with residents about their experiences of themselves as they interact with other people who are struggling to understand their own internal experiences and their own drives. And these are with people who are seeking therapy and want to understand themselves and have, specific limitations or blocks or things that were adaptive coping strategies that now aren't serving them, right? All of that is like such a fascinating field. It's completely different from what we're talking about. But it's called the Mike Rambo podcast, right? So like I'm a perfect guest for that.
We just shrug, we explore around on some different things, and hopefully something useful comes out.
Right.
So when it comes to schizophrenia, a couple other things I want to lay out. For people that end up being diagnosed with schizophrenia, roughly a third will experience like significant long-term improvement compared to like the initial phase, which tends to be amongst the worst phase of the disorder for a lot of people. Right. So roughly a third will experience like awesome improvement long-term, roughly a third will get some improvement, and then roughly a third will get kind of stuck with how bad it was in the beginning.
I think that's a fair estimate.
Okay.
I think that for reasons that I don't understand, that also seems to be true in depression.
Interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, there are, like you said, there are definitely people who get treatment and they engage really well with the treatment and it just happens to work really well for them and they do great. Then there's the middle group that continues to have some symptoms and they have some struggles and they may have to be hospitalized here and there. But generally they got some benefit from it. And then, like you said, there's a group that we sort of consider, we would call it like severe and enduring or
treatment resistant.
Yeah. And I tend to, we use the term treatment resistant, and we use the term treatment failures. And I try really hard not to use that language because it sounds like the person failed or the person resisted, when really it's because either we didn't find the right combo or we don't yet have the right combo of things to help that person.
Sure.
But yeah, unfortunately, the proportion is much larger than you'd like it to be.
Do we know anything? So that initial kind of wave of the disorder, if someone has schizophrenia, tends, like I said, to be amongst the worst proportion of them, whatever their time is having that. Do we know anything about why that is? Like why it kind of comes out of the gate so strong?
Well, in the United States, at least, part of it is that duration of untreated psychosis. So the prodrome is separate from the duration of untreated psychosis. So a prodrome, a person is technically not psychotic. Then you have untreated psychosis, and in the United States we have a very long one. In other countries they have shorter durations of untreated psychosis because they basically have
catch it
nationalized healthcare that catches it faster.
Yeah.
So our duration of untreated psychosis is longer than I think most psychiatrists would like it to be. And so a person comes to clinical attention when things are pretty severe. Now for them, maybe they only took a few months and they went from prodromal to quite severe and then they come to clinical attention. But I suspect that the reason that first episode is the most severe in some ways is that one, they weren't getting any treatment before that to prevent it from getting as bad as it was going to get. And it is scary because you don't know what's happening to you. The second or third time that you have a psychotic experience, it could be equally scary, but it's not as inexplicable. It's like there's something. This has happened before. The people around them tend to notice it earlier than they might have noticed the first time, and so I suspect that on average, the amount of time that a person spends really symptomatic before they get treatment, the second, third, and fourth time, is probably less.
Shorter.
Right. So and hopefully, if the system is working as it should, after they have their first episode, they have a mental health professional that they're checking in with at some degree of regularity, who is asking them, like, how are things going? Are any symptoms kind of starting to increase a little bit? Or, hey, you're planning to get married in the next 6 months. Let's talk about how you can structure your sleep schedule and your stress load so that you don't have unmitigated stress that is landing on top of these symptoms, right? I think in bipolar disorder we think about that a lot, and in schizophrenia we think about that a lot. It's sort of like, how can we help a person think about the plans that they want to make in their life and try to proactively, if at all possible, make changes to therapy availability. Like I said, a lot like sleep is super important, stress management, super important. Can we get those things kind of in place so that if they are going to have something stressful happen, we have built a safety net that makes, even if they do have symptoms, they don't get quite so severe.
Yeah, there's some, when I say they get caught with some cushions.
Yeah, some buffer.
Yeah. I think I read somewhere, it might have been like a 2013 study out of UCLA or something, that it probably was another one of those like genome-wide association studies, but on its face, right, we would tend to associate bipolar disorder more so with something like, say, major depressive disorder, right? But in this study, and I think other studies, they actually were showing the overlap between the buckets of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder were much more similar than actually the clustering of bipolar with, say, major depressive disorder. And one, is that true? And two is what is going on there? Like, what's the story?
Yeah, I will not pretend to know what is going on there. What I will say is that I think that depression in general is, if you take, as I sort of hinted at this a little bit earlier, if you take depression and pull in everybody who meets criteria for depression, that is going to be a much broader set of clusters of symptoms amongst those people than you do, for example, for bipolar disorder type 1. So for bipolar disorder type 1, that person has to have had at least a 1 week period where they met certain criteria: decreased need for sleep, increased goal-directed activity, irritability or euphoria, and it's a much tighter diagnostic category than depression. So you can screen positive for depression in many more different ways than you can screen positive for bipolar disorder. Similarly, you can't screen positive for schizophrenia without having a really strict set of hallucinations and or delusions.
Yep.
It has to have lasted 6 months.
It's pretty evident.
It cannot be attributable to strictly to substance use. It can't be only when you're intoxicated, right? You can't have a diagnosis of schizophrenia if you are only ever having psychotic symptoms when you're using cocaine, right? That is not a schizophrenia diagnosis. So what I wonder about is if basically, by the nature of the way that we classify depression, we are diluting the signal so that it appears as though it doesn't overlap so tightly with other mood disorders, when in fact, perhaps it does, and we just are classifying it poorly. Because the classification for schizophrenia and the classification for bipolar disorder are better. They're not perfect. They're not like Huntington's disease, where it's like, you have this gene, you have this mutation, you have this disorder. So that's one of the things that I wonder about. But the other thing that I wonder about is that we know that schizophrenia, we always describe it as having a thought disorder. So again, the hallucinations, delusions, and that happens in bipolar disorder and depression, but not in everybody. So people with bipolar disorder who have a manic episode, they can have psychotic symptoms within that manic episode. And that might mean that genetically or epigenetically or, in their environment,
any form of
right,
potential complexity,
that they are more similar, or they have some neurobiological similarity to people with schizophrenia, whereas people who have bipolar disorder but never have psychotic symptoms aren't going to cluster that way. Similarly with depression, people with major depressive disorder can have psychotic symptoms when they are severely depressed, and those symptoms sound a whole lot like schizophrenia. But that's not the vast majority of people with depression. The vast majority of people with depression don't have those symptoms. And so again, there might be this gradient of similarity that might be genetically based, epigenetically based, metabolically based. So we haven't talked about metabolism at all.
Yeah.
There are many ways in which I think that our psychiatric diagnostic categories are useful because they help us figure out what treatment we should try first.
Yeah.
And that we tend to guess fairly well. If a person has depression, we do not start by giving them an antipsychotic, we start by giving them an antidepressant. So the categories are meaningful. I do not know that that means that we have done a great job of classifying them by their neurobiological underpinnings. I suspect we probably haven't.
Probably haven't. I kind of view it as, I think it was like following World War I, right? There was like the Sykes-Picot agreement where it's like some lines were drawn up, probably more care in terms of the diagnostic boundaries than was given, right, for the Sykes-Picot agreement in terms of geographic borders. But it's like we have these boundaries now that we, try to operate within. But, I think as we actually map out the terrain, the divisions between what seems like one disorder and a different disorder right now, where the line should actually be will become much more clear. That would be my hunch. I also kind of suspect, when you think of something like schizophrenia and say that someone is actively psychotic, they've got, some very strange beliefs and hallucinations occurring that are far outside the normal realm of reality, so to speak.
Beyond our normal experience of hallucinations, because most people have a hallucination now and again.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a good point. Now I've lost my train of thought. I forget where I'm going. It's okay. Oh, like things that, may seem really complex in terms of their symptomology. I suspect some of the underlying, biology, not that it's going to be simple, but, might be more straightforward than how complex it seems on the outside. And I think I referenced this in a previous episode, but like probably the best historical example I can think of is general paresis of the insane, right? And it was like this disease or disorder of madness that people would be diagnosed with, I think, around the turn of the 20th century, and it seemed really crazy and complicated, like outside looking in. Upon their deaths, right, they would look at the brain, and what they found out was like, oh, they actually just had a syphilis infection that had reached their brain. That's what this was, right? And so it's like this very clear biological root to something that seemed, just too complicated to ever understand. And I don't think anything will likely be that simple in terms of our current, commonly encountered, I guess, psychiatric disorders. But I think it's a good point, just as far as, there is a historical precedent, right, in terms of biology driving psychology.
Absolutely. And I think this ties into something that we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is that although a simple answer eludes us now, it doesn't mean that the answer isn't worth trying to find. And we may have to come up with increasingly complex or multi-layered analytical approaches to try to reveal what those driving etiologic factors are, because the simple explanations have not proved to be very useful in schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. But it doesn't mean there's no explanation.
And it's not that we know nothing either,
No.
right? Say, like, we do know that in a lot of cases there is a difference, say in dopamine signaling or serotonin signaling.
Absolutely.
And even for the disorders of the brain that we think we can figure out, like something like Alzheimer's, we still haven't figured them out, right? We still don't have a treatment really for Alzheimer's. We have a drug, right, that I don't even know if it's still around or not anymore, but that had been improved in recent years that reduces, say, plaques, but in terms of that actually correlating with improved cognition, we don't have anything. So
yeah, there's a lot of overlap between these conditions, and I think you were talking about the different trajectories that we see for patients who have schizophrenia, for example, and for some of the people who have this more severe form where our current treatments are less effective, oftentimes they do end up manifesting what looks like a neurocognitive disorder that actually has a lot of similarities to Alzheimer's disease, and we don't know necessarily do they have schizophrenia and Alzheimer's? Did the schizophrenia turn into something that basically looks like Alzheimer's but biologically isn't really the same? And there's just not very much we know about that. The other thing that the NIH has been trying to study this link between neurodevelopmental disorders and neurodegenerative conditions, because to your point, there is a link there that we do not understand, and we have largely ignored because it was very convenient and easy and popular to ignore people with psychiatric disorders. But now that is something that is being studied more closely, sort of trying to understand, are the genes that are associated with neurodevelopmental disorders, are those leading to earlier manifestations or different manifestations of neurodegenerative conditions? The most classic example would be people who have trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. Those are people who tend to have a very early onset of what looks like a very classic form of Alzheimer's disease at a very young age. And it's thought to be because they have an extra copy of ApoE, but so that's a really good example. It's a very classic example, but there are others.
Yeah. Is the car with a flat tire more likely to also have an engine failure at some point? I would probably bet on that, right? And that does seem to be the case. So as to why exactly,
I wouldn't pretend to understand, but I also think it's that's what makes these disorders and this organ so interesting to study.
Yeah, there's a lot there, that's for sure. You can make a life's work out of it.
Which I'm attempting to do.
So every episode, I've been having the previous guest write a question for the next guest.
Okay.
So right here with this pen, if you want to open it up, there is a question for you.
When it comes to your goals, what are you not doing? Which is an excellent question. There's so many things that I'm not doing. Because there's so little time. I think that what I'm doing less of that I used to really enjoy was therapy for patients. So I do still see patients, I do still work with them, but I don't have time carved out for therapy. And the reason I think that is a deficit for me is sort of like we were talking, this ties back to what we were talking about earlier, that I can do my research in a bubble. I can read about what's going on, what symptoms people have, how I'm going to translate that to the model systems that I use, and then solve that problem, and it will not have helped anybody at all. The most classic example I can think of this is when I was in grad school, the person that I worked with is a movement disorder specialist, and we worked on diseases that are related to Huntington's disease, but his clinic was Huntington's disease. And the work to that point had been trying to study models that had movement problems. And so I got to meet all these families of people who had movement problems. And we would ask them, like, what bothers them? And they would say, I don't really care about the movement. They can make all these unusual movements, like we can move stuff out of the way, they're not going to hurt themselves. What is really hard on us is the personality change. This person doesn't seem like the same person they used to be. They're more irritable, and it's not because they're just depressed because they have Huntington's disease, because they don't actually feel depressed. They don't feel like they're sad, but they're irritable, and it makes it harder for us to have the type of relationship that we used to have. And it really struck me because that whole time I thought that the movement was what really bothered them, that the mortality definitely bothers them, but that the movement, if we could just get that under better control, people's quality of life would be better. And they're like, we don't even care about that. And I think that from a psychiatric perspective, we discussed this a little bit before. If a person has schizophrenia and we do a good job of managing hallucinations and delusions, but they still don't get to have the types of relationships that they want to have, we have probably not really improved their quality of life all that much. And I think that when you don't have time that you have dedicated to sit and talk with people and build a relationship with them, which is what therapy is, it's easy to miss those things. It's easy for a patient not to feel like they want to get vulnerable with you and tell you what they really, really care about because you haven't invested the time. So I think that would probably be the thing that I feel like I'm doing the least of right now that I think does have a lot of impact. And the other thing I think about is that we discussed that my research is translationally very distant from having a medication that I'm going to give somebody, right? So if I think in my daily life, like, what do I do that actually improves anybody's daily life? It is probably the clinical work that I do, and it's probably the therapy work, honestly.
At least the most immediate payoff, right?
It's the most immediate payoff, for sure.
All right, well, thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah.